Hi. The world remembers Chris Tucker as motion, not a man, a crackle of sound and speed that could turn a quiet room into a riot. The kind of performer who did not simply tell jokes but seemed to outrun silence itself. And that is why the image that follows feels so wrong. Not a red carpet, not a roaring crowd, not a booming laugh bouncing off studio walls, but a grown man in his 50s sitting alone with paperwork spread across a table, the air in the room heavy enough to press down on his shoulders. As if the applause that once carried him has finally stopped and left only the truth underneath. At 54, the question people keep circling is not whether he can still make us laugh, but what it cost him to become the Chris Tucker the world demanded, and what happens when the momentum that built you turns into the same force that breaks you. Because his story is not the simple rise of a kid from Georgia who made it big. It is the story of a boy who learned early that laughter could be a shield, a young man who ran toward Los Angeles with hunger in his bones, a star who reached a level of fame so bright it distorted everything around him, and a human being who discovered that success can arrive like a storm, lifting you high while quietly stripping away the parts of your life you assumed were safe. For years, the headlines only tracked the surface, the explosive talent, the cultural lightning of Friday, the global collision with Jackie Chan in Rush Hour, the paychecks that sounded unreal. The way he seemed to vanish for long stretches and return like a ghost the industry could never fully explain. But behind that surface were letters that kept arriving, numbers that kept stacking, grief that kept collecting, and a kind of pressure that does not show on camera. The hardest part is that none of it began with one dramatic scandal. It began the way real collapse often begins, with small decisions, with trust placed in the wrong hands, with distance building inside relationships, with exhaustion disguised as ambition, with a man telling himself he will catch up later, that he will fix it later, that he will rest later, that he will call his father later, that he will be fully present later, that the noise will slow down eventually. Then one day you look around and realize later has already passed you by. There is a moment in his life described in whispers rather than headlines, where the comedy king who once made millions feel lighter is confronted by the opposite feeling, the one no crowd can absorb for you, the sensation of something tightening around your life, quietly, legally, relentlessly. IRS envelopes, court filings, settlements. The strange humiliation of a man who once stood at the top of his field discovering that money is not simply what you earn, but what you keep, what you manage, what you protect, and what you can lose when you're moving too fast to look down. Imagine what it does to someone who grew up counting coins and listening to his parents count bills behind a thin door to build a life that finally looks like safety, only to watch it start to fracture again. Not from poverty this time, but from the complex machinery of fame. And if finances were the only wound, the story would still hurt, but it would not feel like this. Because the deeper pain sits elsewhere, in the losses that arrived like sudden darkouts. The death of his father, the man whose quiet labor once held a family together, a loss that does not just make you sad, but makes you aware of every postponed visit, every missed conversation, every promise you assumed time would allow you to fulfill. And then, even earlier, the loss that cracked him in a different way, the death of Michael Jackson, not as a distant icon, but as a close friend, someone who understood what it meant to be loved by millions and still feel alone. Someone Chris stood beside during storms that would have pushed most people away. When that voice went silent, something in Chris went silent too, and the world mistook that quiet for disappearance, as if the man had simply stepped away, when in reality, he was learning how to carry absence without collapsing in public. This is why the question at 54 is not just where he went, but what he was fighting while he was gone. What happens to a comedian when the laughter stops being medicine and starts being a mask? What happens when the industry still wants the version of you that screams and dances and explodes, but your private life has taught you to move slower, speak less, and measure each choice like it might be your last chance to protect what matters? Tonight, we are not looking at Chris Tucker as a punchline or a meme or a relic of the 1990s. We are looking at the cost of velocity, The way fame can lift you into history while quietly rearranging your heart, and the way a man can survive the highest peaks and the deepest silences and still wake up one morning, older, steadier, and haunted by a single question that no amount of money can answer. After everything you did to become unforgettable, what did you have to forget about yourself to get there? If part one was the storm gathering over Chris Tucker's present, then part two must return to the fragile foundation beneath it, because no collapse makes sense until you understand what was built to withstand it. Before the contracts, before the private jets, before the $20 and $25 million headlines attached to Rush Hour, there was a boy in Atlanta who understood something about pressure long before Hollywood ever applied its version. Chris Tucker was born the youngest of 6 children and in a house stretched thin by need. Being the youngest meant absorbing everything. He watched his father leave for overnight janitorial shifts, hands cracked from chemicals, posture heavy but unbroken. He watched his mother stretch faith across shortages like it was insulation against the cold. Poverty does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through empty refrigerators and late-night bill counting behind thin walls. And in that whisper, Chris learned a survival skill that would define his life. If you can make the room laugh, you can make the room breathe. He studied Eddie Murphy with surgical focus. He replayed Michael Jackson performances until rhythm felt like instinct. But this wasn't imitation for applause. It was practice for escape. By the time he was a teenager, the idea of staying in Georgia felt like surrendering to a script already written for him. So in 1989, at 19, he left for Los Angeles with belief instead of money. That distinction matters, because Los Angeles does not reward belief immediately. It tests it. His first apartment barely qualified as shelter. Peeling paint, a heater that coughed more than it warmed, a mattress thin enough to feel metal beneath it. Hunger became a budgeting strategy. Bus fare was sometimes a luxury. He walked to comedy clubs because quitting would have required returning home with nothing to show for the risk. And failure in Los Angeles carries a different kind of humiliation. It isn't loud. It's indifferent. Rooms that don't laugh. Club owners who glance past you. A sentence like, "Voices like yours don't sell here," delivered casually enough to feel permanent. There's a moment in 1991 after a particularly silent set where he stood outside under an orange streetlight, cold air pressing against his skin, and faced the quiet truth that talent alone does not guarantee survival. This is the moment many never talk about, the near turnaround point. Because every success story has one. The fork in the road where you either shrink to fit what they expect or double down on what makes you different. Chris chose the second path. The very things critics dismissed, the high-pitched velocity, the elastic timing, the almost musical pace of his delivery, became sharper under rejection. Then came 1992, Def Comedy Jam. Backstage, palms sweating, heartbeat loud enough to drown thought. Every no he had ever heard seemed to crowd the room with him. But when the light hit, instinct overruled fear. Energy snapped into place. Timing landed with precision. The audience didn't just laugh, they erupted. For the first time, he felt oxygen instead of resistance. That performance did not make him rich overnight. It made him visible. And visibility in Hollywood is currency before money ever arrives. Small roles followed. A blink-and-miss-it appearance in House Party BA, then, in 1995, a script that would change his trajectory, Friday. Smokey was chaotic, fast, unforgettable. Audiences latched onto him immediately. The character felt spontaneous because much of it was improvised. But here is the detail that reshapes the myth. He was paid only $5,000. $5,000 for a role that would become culturally permanent. It's easy to romanticize that kind of beginning. The hungry artist who becomes iconic. But inside that moment was a complicated emotion. Gratitude mixed with awareness. Fame had arrived before financial security. Doors opened, yes, but not wide enough to eliminate the anxiety that had defined his childhood. When people began recognizing him on the street, shouting Smokey's lines from across parking lots, he was still calculating rent in his head. still unsure whether this breakthrough was stable or temporary. And stability is the word that threads through his early ascent. Because even as Hollywood began to pay attention, Chris Tucker was navigating an internal conflict. Raised deeply within faith, he began questioning the type of humor he wanted to attach his name to. As opportunities expanded, so did the tension between what sold and what aligned with his evolving beliefs. When a sequel to Friday emerged, next Friday, he declined. Publicly, it was framed as a career choice. Privately, it was a spiritual one. That decision strained his relationship with Ice Cube, a collaborator who had shared the hunger of those early years. This is the paradox forming in real time. Success multiplying options while simultaneously multiplying pressure. Each yes shapes your identity. Each no costs something. By the mid-1990s, Chris Tucker was no longer fighting to be seen. He was fighting to remain himself inside visibility. And that tension is rarely discussed in the making of stars. Because what audiences saw was velocity. What they didn't see was calculation. Every new opportunity meant stepping further from the simplicity of Atlanta and deeper into a machine that does not pause once it recognizes profitability. And the machine was about to accelerate. In 1997, he appeared in The Fifth Element as Ruby Road, flamboyant, exaggerated, impossible to ignore. The performance was divisive but unforgettable. He forced himself into a cinematic universe that did not expect him, and that boldness positioned him for what would follow. The stage was set. The hunger was still alive. The industry had finally leaned in. What Chris Tucker did not yet know was that the next step would not simply elevate him. It would redefine him globally. And once you reach that altitude, gravity begins to work differently. By the time 1998 arrived, the tension that had been stretching through Chris Tucker's life finally snapped. Not downward, but upward, like a slingshot released after being pulled to its limit. The script was simple on paper, a mismatched buddy cop comedy pairing a fast-talking American detective with a disciplined Hong Kong inspector. But what happened when Chris Tucker collided with Jackie Chan inside Rush Hour was not simple at all. It was chemistry that felt accidental and engineered at the same time. Rhythm meeting restraint. Velocity meeting precision. The film exploded, grossing over $244 million worldwide. At 27 years old, Tucker wasn't just a rising comedian anymore. He was a global force. The world saw the jokes, the swagger, the electric timing. What it did not see were the 18-hour shooting days. The repetition. The pressure to improvise brilliance on command. The expectation that he would be the kinetic engine driving every scene forward. Success is often described as elevation, but it can feel more like acceleration. Once the first Rush Hour hit, there was no pause for reflection. There were interviews, premieres, press junkets, global travel, and contracts that grew larger with every signature. When Rush Hour High arrived, it shattered expectations with $347 million at the box office. Tucker's salary reportedly reached $20 million. Then came Rush Hour BA with a staggering $25 million payday, plus a share profits. For a brief period, he was the highest-paid comedic actor in Hollywood. The boy who once rationed noodles in Los Angeles apartments was now commanding sums that felt unreal even to him. But something else was growing alongside the checks, an internal unease that money could not quiet. Because while the franchise thrived, his personal life began to thin out. His marriage to Ozza Pryor, formed in the mid-1990s before superstardom fully consumed him, started feeling the strain. Their son, Destin, born in 1998, had arrived at the same moment his career detonated. Imagine the contradiction. Holding a newborn child in one arm, while contracts worth tens of millions land in the other. One demands presence. The other demands motion. Hollywood does not slow down for fatherhood. Shoots lasted months. Travel became constant. Press tours blurred cities together. Success does not politely ask what it is costing you. It simply continues forward. And slowly, distance formed where closeness once lived. By 2003, the marriage ended quietly, without public scandal, but not without private fracture. Later, Tucker would admit the truth in a simple line. I try to be everywhere, and something always gave. That something was time at home. At the same time, another shift was happening, spiritual rather than relational. Raised in a deeply religious household, Tucker began re-evaluating the content of his comedy and the trajectory of his fame. The jokes that once felt natural began to feel misaligned with who he was becoming. He stepped away from certain roles. He declined projects that promised money but conflicted with his evolving convictions. To the outside world, it looked like unpredictability. Inside, it was recalibration. Then came 2007, the height of financial triumph with Rush Hour BA, and paradoxically, the beginning of withdrawal. After the third installment, something unexpected happened. He didn't immediately chase another blockbuster. He didn't flood the market with sequels or spin-offs. Instead, he stepped back. From 2007 to 2011, he was largely absent from major Hollywood projects. Speculation filled the gap. Was he difficult? Was he selective? Was he fading? The truth was more complicated. The silence wasn't laziness. It was conflict. Fame had delivered everything he thought it would, and left him restless. There's a rarely discussed psychological effect of extreme success. When you achieve your highest external goals before 30, you are forced to confront who you are without pursuit. And for Tucker, that confrontation was uncomfortable. He had climbed so fast that he had not fully processed the ascent. Then, quietly, the financial tremors began. Between 2002 and 2010, tax liabilities accumulated. Complex contracts, advisors, business structures. The architecture of wealth is not as simple as cashing checks. When the IRS notices started arriving, they did not arrive with drama. They arrived with numbers. And numbers do not negotiate emotionally. By 2011, millions were owed. Years later, the figure would climb near $9 sound million before being settled for $3 sound million. But the emotional impact cannot be measured in digits. For someone raised in scarcity, the reappearance of financial instability reopens childhood fear. It is not just debt. It is regression. It is the fear that everything built can evaporate. He sold properties. He tightened expenses. He recalculated. Publicly, the narrative became fall from fame. Privately, it was restructuring. But while finances strained, another blow struck deeper. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died. To the public, it was the loss of an icon. To Tucker, it was the loss of a brother-like confidant. Their friendship had been real and sustained. Tucker stood by Jackson during legal trials, traveled with him, laughed with him in private spaces where celebrity masks could drop. Jackson once told him, "Thank you for making me feel normal." When that voice went silent, the grief did not erupt publicly. It folded inward. Tucker went quiet. He turned off his phone. He sat alone. He later admitted that he called Jackson's number after his death, letting it ring, as if denial might reverse reality. The world watched a memorial. Tucker experienced absence. And then, in 2016, another pillar fell. His father died. The man whose labor defined dignity in his childhood was gone. This loss struck differently. Not globally, but intimately. Regrets surfaced, postponed visits, delayed conversations, the illusion that there would always be more time. Grief compounded. Financial stress lingered. Career momentum had slowed. By his mid-40s, Tucker was facing something far more complex than fame or failure. Identity reconstruction. Who are you when applause fades? Who are you when the money shrinks? Who are you when the people who anchored you are gone? In 2012, he returned in Silver Linings Playbook, a smaller role marked by restraint rather than fireworks. The performance was subtle, almost understated. It signaled something. He was no longer chasing noise. In 2016, he appeared in Billy Lynn's long halftime walk, again measured. And in 2023, in Air, he embodied warmth rather than chaos. The high-pitched whirlwind had evolved into steadiness. This is the part many miss. His story is not a dramatic implosion. It is a recalibration arc. The velocity that once defined him has slowed into intention. The man who once outran silence has learned to sit inside it. But slowing down comes with its own confrontation. Because when movement stops, reflection begins. And reflection is where the hardest truths wait. The next chapter is not about box office numbers. It is about what he carries now, at 54, after the laughter, the loss, the lawsuits, the legacy. There's a difference between stepping back and being pushed back, and in Chris Tucker's life, the line between those two became painfully blurred. After the explosive heights of rush hour BA, the outside world assumed he had everything secured: money, legacy, cultural permanence. But what followed was not another blockbuster. It was silence. Not dramatic, not scandalous, just quiet. And in Hollywood, quiet can be more unsettling than failure. Between 2007 and 2011, Chris Tucker was largely absent from major film releases. Offers existed. Scripts circulated. But something inside him resisted momentum for momentum's sake. The boy who once sprinted toward opportunity now hesitated before every yes. That hesitation confused executives. It frustrated collaborators. It created rumors. But hesitation is often the sign of someone who has seen how high the climb goes and how thin the air becomes at the top. Then came the financial reckoning in full clarity. IRS notices have been arriving quietly for years, but by 2011 the numbers could no longer be deferred or misunderstood. Millions in unpaid taxes across multiple years, 2002, 2006, 2008, 2010, stacked like invisible cracks beneath a polished floor. By 2021, the government alleged that the debt had reached approximately $9 million before eventual negotiations reduced the figure to roughly $3 million. Headlines framed it as collapse. But the deeper reality was structural failure, trust placed in advisors who mismanaged or misunderstood the architecture of his income. This is the paradox of sudden wealth. The skills that earn it are rarely the skills required to protect it. For someone raised in scarcity, the humiliation cuts deeper. It is not merely the loss of money. It is the return of instability. Selling property, particularly his Florida home, was not just a financial transaction. It reopened a psychological memory of fragility. The image of placing keys down for the last time carries weight that the public never sees. A man who once commanded $25 million per film walking through emptied rooms, feeling echoes where certainty once lived. But financial strain was only one layer of the storm. The emotional architecture had already been shaken by loss. In 2009, the death of Michael Jackson hollowed out a space in Tucker's private world that fame could not refill. Their friendship had been genuine and sustained beyond publicity cycles. Tucker had stood beside Jackson during courtroom trials, offering loyalty in seasons when many withdrew. When Jackson died, the world mourned a global icon. Tucker lost a confidant who understood the strange isolation that extreme fame produces. He later described going silent after the news, not performing grief publicly, not narrating pain for interviews, just sitting in it. And then, in 2016, another blow, the death of his father. Norris Tucker Sr. was not a celebrity. He was something steadier. A man who cleaned office buildings through the night and returned home with cracked hands but intact dignity. Losing him forced Chris to confront regret in its most unfiltered form. The postponed visit, the conversation assumed to have time, the illusion that tomorrow is guaranteed. He admitted later, almost softly, "I truly thought we had more time." Grief compounded with financial stress creates a unique psychological weight. One affects the heart. The other affects stability. Together, they force reevaluation. Around this period, something subtle shifted in his public presence. The explosive, high-decibel performer of the late 1990s softened. Interviews became slower. Answers more deliberate. The manic energy that once defined his screen persona seemed tempered by lived experience. He was no longer racing the room. He was measuring it. When he returned to film in Silver Linings Playbook, the performance surprised many. It was restrained, warm, almost quiet. There were no vocal acrobatics, no velocity, It was as if he had stepped away from spectacle and leaned into presence. In Billy Lynn's long halftime walk, the restraint deepened, and by the time he appeared in air, the transformation felt complete. He did not try to resurrect the past version of himself. He allowed the camera to meet who he had become. This evolution mirrors something broader, the recalibration of identity after crisis. At his peak, Tucker was known for volume, fast speech, rapid-fire improvisation, physical intensity. But crisis forces compression. It strips excess. It removes what cannot survive pressure. What remained was clarity. He began selecting projects aligned not with paydays, but with values. His stand-up evolved as well. Cleaner material, slower pacing, more reflection woven between punchlines. The laughter remained, but it no longer felt frantic. It felt intentional. His philanthropic efforts through the Chris Tucker Foundation also expanded quietly, supporting education, youth initiatives, and underserved communities. Not as branding, as balance. Giving became part of recalibration, returning what life once strained him to earn. But even as stability returned, the internal questions lingered. What does success mean after you've seen how fragile it is? What does security look like after you've lost it once? How do you measure worth when applause no longer defines it? At 54, Chris Tucker's life appears quieter from the outside. His net worth, estimated around $5 million, feels modest compared to past headlines. Yet the number tells only part of the story. The greater wealth now lies in something less visible: sustainability. He lives primarily in Georgia, close to roots rather than red carpets. He spends time with his son, Destin, now an adult pursuing filmmaking. He walks slower, speaks softer, chooses carefully. The man who once outran silence has learned to coexist with it. And perhaps that is the most unexpected transformation of all, because part 4 of his life is not about comeback spectacle. It is about durability, surviving the hurricane of fame, surviving the drought that followed, and discovering that identity rebuilt slowly often stands stronger than identity built at speed. But even with this steadiness, one layer remains: the private cost of love, relationships, and the weight of trying to be everything at once. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that does not explode in public. It does not trend. It does not create scandal. It unfolds slowly, quietly, inside rooms where only 2 people understand what is slipping away. For Chris Tucker, that heartbreak did not arrive through headlines or lawsuits. It arrived through distance, the kind that forms when ambition accelerates faster than intimacy can keep pace. Before the world crowned him a global star, before Rush Hour rewrote his financial reality, there was Ozza Pryor. Their relationship began during the stretch of years when Tucker was still building, still fighting for recognition, still close enough to uncertainty that love felt grounding rather than complicated. They married quietly in 1997, without spectacle. There were no media storms, no celebrity choreography, just 2 young people believing that connection could withstand momentum. Then 1998 happened. The birth of their son, Destin, coincided almost exactly with the explosion of Rush Hour. Imagine holding your newborn while Hollywood simultaneously demands global travel, endless press tours, and contracts worth tens of millions. Fatherhood requires stillness. Fame demands motion, and motion wins most of the time. At first, the adjustment feels manageable. Late-night calls, flights home between shoots, promises that this season is temporary. But success rarely slows once it identifies profitability. Sequels are scheduled. Promotional tours expand. International markets open. The world begins pulling in every direction. Inside the home, something more subtle begins to erode: presence. Ozza remained grounded, steady, protective of their son's normalcy. Chris was not indifferent. He was stretched. Every decision to remain on set another week, every red carpet appearance, every overseas commitment chipped away at hours that would never return. There were no dramatic confrontations, just accumulation, missed dinners, delayed holidays, conversations that grew shorter less spontaneous. Later, Tucker would admit with disarming honesty, "I try to be everywhere," and something always gave. The something was not love. It was proximity. By 2003, the marriage ended quietly. There were no explosive interviews, no public bitterness, just paperwork and shared custody. That restraint speaks volumes. They chose dignity over spectacle. But dignity does not erase pain. It simply contains it. The deeper cost revealed itself in smaller moments. A 5-year-old son saying goodnight. A father realizing that success does not immunize you from regret. For Tucker, this chapter reshaped his definition of achievement. Money and recognition had not preserved what mattered most. And that awareness carries weight long after divorce papers are signed. Yet even in separation, grace endured. Tucker and Aza maintained a respectful co-parenting relationship. Destin grew up shielded from conflict, allowed to build his own identity without inheriting public drama. Today, Destin is pursuing filmmaking, an echo of his father's creative world, but from behind the camera. Their bond remains close, grounded not in celebrity, but in shared growth. If the marriage represented one kind of heartbreak, another followed, softer, more private, and less defined by paperwork. Around 2007, Tucker's path crossed with India Ari, a musician known more for introspection than spectacle. Their connection did not begin in flashbulbs. It grew in quiet spaces, charity events, backstage conversations, long drives without agenda. Two people navigating visibility while searching for something steadier beneath it. The timing, however, was fragile. Tucker was entering a season of financial tension and internal recalibration. Ari was deepening her own creative and spiritual journey. They recognized something in each other: gentleness, faith, a shared understanding of fame's distortions. But even mutual understanding cannot override divergent trajectories. By 2008, they separated without public fallout. No accusations, no drama, just an acknowledgement that alignment requires more than affection. Years later, Tucker would reflect on that period with warmth rather than regret. Some relationships do not last forever, but they restore something essential for a time. India represented calm after velocity, proof that connection could exist without performance. These relational chapters reveal a pattern. Tucker's greatest struggles were rarely professional. They were personal negotiations between speed and presence, ambition and intimacy. Hollywood rewards momentum. Relationships require deceleration. Balancing both at extreme levels is rarely sustainable. At 54, this history has matured into perspective. He speaks of fatherhood differently now, less as responsibility, more as recalibration. Success is no longer defined by contracts. It is defined by whether he shows up, by whether he listens, by whether he chooses intentionally rather than reactively. The man who once moved faster than silence now values slowness. It is easy to frame his life as a dramatic arc of fame and financial turbulence. But the deeper narrative is about relational cost, about how even good men, driven by hunger and opportunity, can unintentionally sacrifice proximity while pursuing provision, about how love can endure without possession, about how regret can become instruction rather than paralysis. Because what Chris Tucker ultimately learned is this: applause does not tuck your child into bed. Red carpets do not sit at your father's table. Box office numbers do not replace the quiet security of shared mornings. His evolution in recent years, the selective roles, the calmer interviews, the cleaner stand-up, reflect a man no longer sprinting for validation. He has already seen what acceleration can take. Now, he moves differently. And yet, beneath this steadiness remains one final layer of weight: the compounded grief of losing pillars, the emotional residue that lingers even after reconciliation and rebuilding. The next chapter is not about money or marriage. It is about legacy, what remains after loss reshapes you, and what a man chooses to protect when everything else has already been tested. There's a moment in every life when achievement stops being the headline and loss becomes the turning point. For Chris Tucker, that moment did not arrive on a film set or in a courtroom. It arrived through a phone call. On January 14th, 2016, his father, Norris Tucker Sr., passed away. To the world, this was a private family matter. To Chris, it was the collapse of a foundation that had quietly supported every success he ever experienced. His father was not famous. He did not attend premieres or command interviews. He worked night shifts cleaning office buildings, hands worn from chemicals, body exhausted, but spirit steady. He modeled something more durable than celebrity, dignity. When that voice disappeared, something inside Chris shifted permanently. He later admitted, in a tone stripped of performance, "I truly thought we had more time." That sentence carries the universal ache of postponed conversations, of assuming that tomorrow is guaranteed, of believing that success can wait while family remains constant. The drive back to Georgia for the funeral was not just physical travel. It was psychological return to the house where bills were counted carefully, where laughter was survival, where dreams were whispered before they were declared. Standing in his father's room, seeing a jacket folded the way only his father folded it, smelling faint traces of aftershave, he confronted a reality no award can soften. The man who taught him integrity would never speak again. But grief did not end there. 7 years earlier, on June 25, 2009, another voice went silent. Michael Jackson. The world lost the king of pop. Chris lost a friend who understood the strange isolation that accompanies extreme fame. Their bond was not superficial. Tucker had stood beside Jackson during legal battles, offering loyalty when others distanced themselves. He appeared in Jackson's "You Rock My World" era, and not for exposure, but for proximity. When news broke of Jackson's death, Tucker froze. He later described the sensation as the room tilting, gravity shifting. He scrolled to Jackson's contact and press call, letting it ring, as if denial might reverse finality. It didn't. At the public memorial in July 2009, surrounded by tens of thousands and millions watching globally, he felt a peculiar loneliness. Grief is often loud in crowds and quiet in solitude. For Chris, it became internal. He did not dramatize it in interviews. He carried it. Losing a father fractures identity. Losing a friend who shared your emotional language fractures trust and permanence. These compounded losses reshaped him more than financial headlines ever could. After his father's death, those close to Tucker noticed a change in his pacing. He moved slower, spoke more deliberately, laughed without urgency. The manic velocity that once defined his on-screen persona softened into steadiness. It was not exhaustion. It was recalibration. He began choosing differently. Professionally, this shift was visible in his performance choices. In Air, his portrayal was measured, warm, reflective. There was no attempt to resurrect the high-pitched whirlwind of the late 1990s. Instead, he embodied presence, stillness, control. The evolution felt intentional. But the deeper transformation was spiritual. Raised in a religious household, Tucker had always carried faith quietly. After loss, that faith intensified, not in spectacle, but in practice. Prayer became grounding. Charity became expression. Through the Chris Tucker Foundation, he supported education initiatives, food security programs, and underserved communities. Not for publicity cycles, for balance. Giving became a form of honoring what his father modeled. Responsibility without applause. There is a line often repeated about fame, that it amplifies who you already are. In Tucker's case, loss clarified who he wanted to be. The noise that once defined his identity faded in importance. Integrity replaced velocity as the priority. At 54, his net worth is often cited as modest compared to former heights. But wealth is no longer the measurement. Stability is. Presence is. Fatherhood remains central. His son, Destin, now an adult filmmaker, represents continuity, a reminder that legacy extends beyond box office receipts. The public once saw Chris Tucker as explosion. Today, he resembles endurance. He has survived the hurricane of global superstardom. He has survived the quiet humiliation of financial correction. He has survived the hollowing effect of losing pillars. And in surviving, he has changed. The question is no longer what happened to him. The question is what he chose to carry forward after everything fell silent. In that final chapter, the man at 54, standing not at the peak, not at the bottom, but in the middle of earned clarity, is where the real story concludes. At 54, the most surprising thing about Chris Tucker is not what he lost. It is what remains. The world once measured him in decibels and dollars. $20 million for Rush Hour hiked $25 million plus backend for Rush Hour BA global premieres. Stadium laughter. A comedic velocity so sharp it felt almost supernatural. For a period in the early 2000s, he was the highest-paid comedic actor in Hollywood. The industry moved when he moved. But fame is a wave, and waves recede. Today, estimates place his net worth around $5 million, a number that startles those who remember the height of his earnings. Yet that number, stripped of context, misses the point entirely. The man standing at 54 is not the same man who sprinted through his 20s. The measurement has changed. He lives primarily in Georgia now, not hidden, but grounded. Trees instead of traffic. Quiet instead of chaos. His home is not built to impress. It is built to hold. Stone, wood, open light. A saltwater pool reflecting sky rather than flashbulbs. An office lined with scripts, Bibles, family photographs. Reminders that applause fades but memory stays. There is something intentional about the way he moves now. Slower. Deliberate. He walks regularly. Trains lightly. Eats simply. The body that once seemed all nerves and rhythm now carries lived weight. Grief, correction, recalibration. Age has not erased the pain of losing his father in 2016. It has taught him how to carry it without collapsing. The death of Michael Jackson still echoes quietly in memory. But the echo no longer destabilizes him. It steadies him. Professionally, he has chosen restraint over noise. In air, his presence felt grounded, warm, assured. No frantic improvisation. No need to dominate every scene. Just control. Intention. He has continued stand-up, but the comedy has matured. Cleaner material, reflective pacing, humor that emerges from recognition rather than chaos. The laughter remains. The urgency does not. Fatherhood anchors him most visibly. Destin, born in 1998 at the same moment his career detonated, is now an adult filmmaker. Their relationship appears unforced, built on conversation rather than correction. Tucker has said that fatherhood recalibrated his understanding of success. Being present now matters more than being everywhere once did. The irony is sharp. He earned millions being everywhere and learned fulfillment by choosing when not to be. His philanthropic work continues quietly through the Chris Tucker Foundation, scholarships, youth programs, food initiatives in underserved communities. There are no loud campaigns attached. Giving is not branding for him. It is balance. It is a private counterweight to public excess. So what happened to Chris Tucker? He did not disappear. He decelerated. The loudest version of him belonged to a specific era, the 1990s and early 2000s, when Hollywood rewarded excess and speed. But the man at 54 understands something that the man at 27 could not. Velocity is unsustainable. Identity built on applause is fragile. Wealth without oversight evaporates. Relationships without presence thin out. Time without intention slips. He survived extreme ascent. He survived financial reckoning. He survived compounded grief. And survival, in his case, required transformation. There is a quiet dignity in that. Because not every story ends in triumphant comeback or dramatic downfall. Some end in steadiness. In a man who no longer needs to prove volume. In someone who once outran silence and now sits comfortably inside it. If you look closely, the shift is visible in his eyes during interviews. Less urgency, more awareness. He does not speak as someone trying to reclaim the spotlight. He speaks as someone who has already seen what it costs. At 54, Chris Tucker's life is not a headline about collapse. It is a case study in recalibration. The boy who laughed to survive became a star who laughed to conquer. The man who lost money and pillars learned to laugh, to endure. And maybe that is why his story resonates more now than it did at the height of his fame. Because in the end, the real measure of a life is not how high it rises. It is what remains standing after everything else has fallen away. If this journey moved you, if it made you think about loss, ambition, regret, or resilience, share your thoughts. Stories like his remind us that success is not immunity. It is responsibility. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is slow down, rebuild quietly, and keep walking forward without the noise. That is what happened to Chris Tucker. Not a fall, a reckoning, and then a choice to remain.